In the quiet suburbs, where the golf course pressed up against rows of tidy homes, Daniel spotted what he thought was a lost kitten. He was walking along the edge of the fairway, as he often did after work, when a faint cry pulled his attention toward a cluster of daisies near the fence line. At first, he thought it was the thin mewl of a stray, maybe a neighborhood cat stuck out too far from home. But when he crouched down, brushing the grass aside, his breath caught. What stared back at him with wide, uncertain eyes was no house cat. A small, trembling body, covered in brown fur, with paws already too large for his frame, and a muzzle still soft with baby roundness. A bear cub, no more than a few weeks old, lay hunched in the grass, whimpering quietly as though unsure what else to do. Daniel froze, his heart skipping, but the cub didn't bolt. Instead, it let out another pitiful cry, and something twisted inside him. He looked around instinctively, half expecting a mother bear to crash through the hedges in defense of her young, but the fairway stretched empty in every direction. The only sound was the drone of a mower up the hill, where one of the neighbors in a wide-brimmed hat was trimming his lawn. Daniel hesitated, then reached out slowly, murmuring soft words he wasn't sure the cub would even understand. To his surprise, the little body leaned toward him, as though drawn to warmth. Carefully, almost reverently, Daniel lifted the cub into his arms. It was lighter than he expected, all bones and fur, and it pressed its head against his chest as though it had been waiting for someone. Carrying the cub, Daniel walked over to the man mowing his lawn. "Hey," he called out above the hum of the machine. "Ever seen this little guy around?" The neighbor stopped, pushed his hat back, and his eyes widened. "Yeah, been hanging around the edge here for a couple days. Haven't seen its mother. Figured it wouldn't last much longer." That was all Daniel needed to hear. He tightened his arms around the trembling cub and turned toward home. Daniel's father, Mark, was a man of steady habits, whose life ticked along with the precision of a clock. He believed in rules, order, and the kind of structure that made life predictable. Their house already held one elderly orange tomcat named Oliver, and Mark had made it clear many times before, their home was not a zoo. When Daniel walked into the living room carrying the bear cub, Mark's brows drew together into a hard line. "Daniel," he said, his voice firm but measured, "that is a bear. We can't keep another animal, much less a wild one." Daniel didn't argue, not aloud anyway. Inside, he already knew he wasn't letting this cub go back out to fend for itself. He took an old fleece blanket, tucked it into a cardboard box, and set a small bowl of water nearby in his bedroom. The cub curled up almost immediately, eyelids drooping with exhaustion. Daniel stroked its fur gently and whispered, "You're safe now, little guy." He decided to name him Ash. The first days passed quietly. Mark kept his distance, making no effort to acknowledge the new presence in the house, though Daniel noticed the way his father's eyes flicked toward the hallway whenever a faint whimper carried through the walls. Oliver, the old tomcat, gave Ash a cursory sniff before returning to his spot by the window, apparently unbothered. Daniel fed Ash small amounts of softened food, careful with his tiny stomach, and sat beside him until sleep claimed the cub. One evening, as Mark dozed on the couch with an old western playing on the television, Daniel was in the kitchen washing dishes when a faint shuffle caught his ear. He turned just in time to see Ash creeping out of the hallway, his steps cautious but determined. The cub waddled across the carpet, paused by the couch, and with surprising effort clambered onto Mark's chest. Mark stirred, blinking awake to find two brown eyes staring at him. Ash pawed at his shirt, then pressed his nose under Mark's chin, seeking warmth. Daniel held his breath, waiting for his father to push the cub away, but Mark didn't. Instead, his hand rose, slow and uncertain, and came to rest on the cub's back. A low, rumbling sound escaped Ash's throat, something deeper than a cat's purr, but just as contented. Daniel's chest ached as he watched. That was the turning point. After that night, small changes crept in. Mark began leaving scraps of cooked chicken on the counter, pretending it was just extra. He folded a towel and placed it neatly on the floor near his chair, a place for Ash to curl up. Soon he was calling softly for the cub in the mornings, his tone gentler than Daniel had ever heard. Ash would toddle over, tail short and wagging like a pup's, nuzzling against his legs. Daniel noticed his father smiling more often, especially when Ash was near. Weeks passed, and Ash began to grow. His fur thickened, his little claws sharpened, and his clumsy steps turned into stronger strides. His paws looked far too large for his body, a clear sign he would one day be far bigger than they could imagine. Yet despite his wild heritage, Ash shadowed Daniel and Mark from room to room. If Daniel sat to read, Ash curled beside him. If Mark worked in the garage, Ash would back curiously at screws and sniff the toolbox. The house filled with a new rhythm, one that revolved around the presence of this once-lost creature. One Saturday morning, Mark went outside to rake leaves. Ash watched from the window until Daniel opened the door. The cub bounded out with clumsy joy, diving into the piles of orange and brown, scattering them in every direction. Mark laughed, a sound so rich and unguarded that Daniel froze in quiet awe. It had been years since he'd heard his father laugh like that. Later, over coffee, Mark admitted, "I didn't think I'd take to him, but he's got something about him." Ash's energy filled their lives. He had a habit of sitting by the door when Daniel returned from work, bounding forward the moment he stepped inside. Sometimes he'd carry one of Daniel's socks in his mouth, laying it at his feet as though it were a prize. At night, he sprawled across the couch, wedged between the two men, his head on Daniel's knee and his hind legs stretched against Mark's side. Neighbors began to notice. One man walking his dog paused at the fence, staring. "Is that a bear cub in your yard?" he asked, disbelief plain in his voice. Mark simply grinned, resting a hand on Ash's head. "Yeah, and he thinks he's family." The neighbor shook his head, muttering, but couldn't help smiling when Ash rolled over for a belly rub. Seasons passed. Ash grew larger, stronger, more imposing, yet he never lost the affection that bound him to them. Mark began taking him into the yard for supervised play, tossing branches for him to chase, or dangling a rope for him to leap at. Daniel sometimes watched from the porch, marveling at how naturally his father had stepped into the role of caretaker. The cub they had once worried over was now a robust young bear, yet he moved through their days as seamlessly as any pet. One crisp autumn evening, Daniel stepped out onto the porch just as the sun sank low, painting the yard in amber light. Mark sat on the steps, shoulders relaxed, gazing at the quiet scene. Across his lap sprawled Ash, larger now, his frame stretched out with complete trust. His tufted ears twitched at distant sounds, but his eyes were half closed, his entire body loose with comfort. Mark's hand moved in slow strokes down the thick fur, fingers disappearing into the dense coat. The steady rhythm seemed to calm them both. Daniel leaned against the railing, watching. After a long silence, Mark glanced up and caught Daniel's eye. His voice was low, almost carried away by the breeze, when he said, "You know, when you brought him home, I thought you'd made a mistake, but now I can't imagine life without him." Daniel smiled, the truth of it sinking deep. Ash hadn't just found safety with them, he had reshaped their lives in ways neither had expected. The house itself seemed to hold more warmth now. The sound of claws clicking lightly across the hardwood, the thump of Ash hopping onto the window ledge, the low rumble of his contented growls, all of it became part of their daily soundtrack. Even ordinary routines, making coffee in the morning, folding laundry at night, felt infused with a quiet joy. Ash's presence reminded them that beauty was not only in grand gestures, but in shared, ordinary moments. Sometimes, Daniel would catch himself smiling at the smallest things, the way Ash tilted his head curiously when the kettle whistled, or how he sprawled across the rug as if he owned every inch of it. Mark began humming again while cooking, his voice low and steady, accompanied by the occasional grunt of Ash shifting near his feet. Even chores that once felt dull, sweeping, stacking dishes, carrying groceries in from the car, turned into something softer with Ash trailing close, his watchful eyes following every move. Nights, too, had changed. No longer was the living room a place of silence, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. Now there was the sound of Ash's slow, steady breathing, the occasional twitch of a paw as he dreamed, and the quiet comfort of knowing they were not alone. Even rain against the windows or wind rushing through the trees outside felt less empty with him stretched nearby, his presence steady and grounding. In these small but constant ways, Ash wove himself into the fabric of their days. His existence was never loud or demanding. He simply was, and in that being, he made every corner of their home softer, every task lighter, every evening warmer. They began to realize that joy wasn't only found in adventures or milestones, but in these shared rhythms, these ordinary moments. Though he had been born wild, Ash had chosen them. And in his choice, Daniel and Mark found themselves changed. They had given him shelter, but in return he had given them laughter, closeness, and the reminder that family could be built in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes Daniel would pause in the hallway and see Mark leaning down, murmuring softly to Ash, scratching behind his ears, the big bear's head pressing closer with trust. In those moments, Daniel understood with clarity, it wasn't only Ash who had been rescued. They all had. Ash had a way of making the house feel alive in ways the men hadn't realized it was missing. His heavy footsteps padding across the floor became as familiar as the ticking of a clock. The deep rumble of his breath when he sprawled out by the fire filled the silence that used to weigh on them in the evenings. Even his clumsy curiosity, the way he nudged open cupboards or pawed at shoes left by the door, was a reminder that this space wasn't just theirs anymore. It belonged to him too. They found themselves laughing more, talking more, even sitting closer, as if his presence bridged something invisible between them. There were nights when storms shook the windows, and Ash, though strong and fearless in so many ways, would edge closer to the couch, pressing his broad body against their legs, as if to ask for comfort. Mark would drape an arm over him without hesitation. Daniel would lay a reassuring hand on his back, and together they would wait for the thunder to pass. It was in those small moments that Daniel realized how naturally Ash had threaded himself into the fabric of their lives. He wasn't a guest anymore, wasn't something fragile to be worried over, or something wild to be kept at a distance. He was theirs. Ash grew into his strength, his coat shining, his presence commanding, yet he never stopped waiting at the door when Daniel's car pulled into the drive. Rain, snow, or blazing summer heat, it never mattered. He was there, head lifted, eyes bright, as though every return was a miracle worth celebrating. He still stretched across the couch between them, still followed their steps from room to room, not because he needed to, but because he chose to. He was big now, massive even, but the habit never faded. The house had learned to bend around him, and so had their hearts. And in that quiet, steadfast loyalty, he gave them something neither man had realized was missing until it was there. A home bound not by walls, but by love.